Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 523, and today is January 5th, 2024. We have a lot of news on today's show, but I want to mention a couple things first. So, if for anybody who hasn't watched yet, last week myself and co-host of this show, Connor Freeman, were on Part of the Problem with Dave Smith. So that was a really awesome experience. Scott Horton, our boss of the Libertarian Institute, joined us for a Libertarian Institute panel. So we got to discuss the Institute, which, by the way, we hit our fundraising goal. So thank you all so much for helping us to do that. I know we got a lot of contributions from this audience. So that's huge. Also, this audience, I know, went out of their way to let Dave Smith know that you really liked having me and Connor on the show. The comments, at least on the YouTube video for the Part of the Problem appearance, are very positive. And so thank you all so much for, not only listening, but letting Dave know that you liked myself and Connor. And then I was also on Judge Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom. That was just yesterday, so I will post that on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. But head on over to the judge's channel. You really should be listening to that show if you want to keep up with foreign policy. He does so many great interviews every week. Ray McGovern, Douglas McGregor, Matthew Ho, Mats Blumenthal, and those are just, a short list of the names I put together. He has a lot of great people on that show, and I'm very happy to add my name to that list. I think I did very well on the show. You guys be the judge. If you liked it, please, let them know again. Give some positive feedback in the comment section. Let them know that you'd like to have me back on, because I would really like to do that show again as well. Anyways, again, another thank you just to give my audience. I've got to talk to people like Dave Smith and Andrew Napolitano, two people that I've listened to and, have really paid attention to with the judge. I've read his books and watched his shows back on Fox News for years. And so, you guys tuning in and, letting people know that you like this show, that you like the work I do, helps me have the platform that I get invited and asked onto these other programs. So I really appreciate everything you guys have done for this show over the past couple of years and all the support you've given me. Really, I've almost been with antiwar.com 5 years now. I've been at the Institute, I want to say 7 or 8. So, over a long period of time now. Anyways, let's get into the show today. The first thing I want to do is at the end of the year, I solicited, if any listeners had questions they would like me to answer, kind of about 2024, I would go ahead and do that. So I got 3 questions. I got a couple others, and I felt like I could kind of just lump them all into 3 general questions. So the first one was from John, who, I know has been a longtime listener of the show and gives me a lot of feedback over the years and some really helpful insights at times too. And he just asked why, the liberals have really grafted on to the Gaza issue and, have taken a staunchly, anti-interventionist, position. They don't want the U.S. to keep arming Israel. I guess some of them have been a little overzealous and maybe are, verging to past the pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas territory, but that's not very many people. Those are really just the people on the margins. And, why the liberals have, adopted this Gaza issue in a way they didn't with, say, the wars in Yemen or, in Ukraine. They were pro-war. And so I think a lot of this is, there's a really good interview by Scott Horton recently, and he's had this guy on the show a couple times now. I want to say his name is John Braun, but I will, I'll put it out on my Twitter feed today at @KyleAnzalone_. And I would recommend listening to that interview because he talks about these like Twitter storms and basically, however the algorithm works, there's certain issues that just overwhelm everything and get into everybody's feeds. And then, once it's kind of there, it just becomes its own self-perpetuating machine. And so, the war in Ukraine broke that machine, but that was on the pro-war side, right? On this show, we talked about how there were pro-war protests. And so in Gaza, that has, been representative of the Palestinian cause. Now, I think part of the reason that the situation in Gaza has gotten so much more attention than, say, the situation in Yemen is A few things. One, this is the Holy Land, generally speaking, and so unlike with Yemen, I think a lot of Americans do feel some personal attachment, to the land of the Abrahamic faiths, because most Americans still do generally at least identify with one of those, and so I think that's something that maybe piques people's interest a little bit more than say Yemen or Sudan, Syria, Iraq, even. I think another part of it is where we are, technology wise. So maybe if the Iraq war was happening today, there, the level of video phones and communication and things like that people could, live stream what the Americans are doing in Iraq and things like that. Maybe that would have drawn more sympathy to the Iraqi cause. But I certainly think even with the communications blackout, the amount of fairly good video that you're able to get. And look, so I don't watch the mainstream media. Occasionally I will, click on a clip on Twitter or something and see what these people are saying. But if you watch the mainstream media, I understand how you're still pro-Israel from some of the reports that I have seen. But if you're just online, you see the devastation, the destruction, the starving children, the mutilated children, and the attacks, the damage done to the hospitals and the other infrastructure of Gaza is just so overwhelming that it really can't be ignored. And um, unfortunately for Yemen, I guess 2015 is quite a while ago now, right? In terms of, especially in terms of technology and live streaming and video, because quality is very important. When video is sharp, especially when there's like a lot of movement and motion. So if you go back even a few, like I would say 3, 4, 5 years now, I guess probably about 5 years, because I have a 4-year-old iPhone, but I have the one with like the upgraded camera, and captures pretty good motion video. And but before that, if you remember, like motion video was often fairly blurry, and so it was really hard to distinctly say that this is a certain person, this happened here, and things like that, where you could really do that with a lot of the video that we're getting out of Palestine. So a big part is just, the fact that you have a good number of Palestinian journalists in Gaza who have done very brave work among very, very rough conditions. And then on top of that, you just have a lot of citizen journalists in Gaza. And so that has been important as well. So I think those are probably the bigger things in that. And Israel has just been a bigger and more important issue in the U.S. for years and years and years now, in a way that, Sudan hasn't been. So when you're talking about Israel, people are just, I think, more familiar with it. And I think that drives a lot of the attention from people who normally don't pay attention to foreign policy. So, it's good that the liberals are good on this issue. It's certainly better than them being bad on the issue, because we know how destructive they could be when you're opposed to them. But at the same time, some of the tactics that they're using, like shutting down roads, I'm not a big fan of. And some of the arguments that they make are just, the kinds of arguments that liberals make. So it's not always the best to have them on your side, but it is good that there are more people that are opposing, sending more aid to Israel, because that's really what needs to happen. End our aid to Israel. Let the Israelis take care of themselves, and that's going to force them to treat the Palestinians in a far better way than they currently are. So the second question I got was on just conflicts in Africa. This was from Matthew Butts, who I met last year, I believe in Reno. If we met in Vegas, sorry, Matthew. But I do know we met when we were out somewhere out west last year, and it was a great time. And yeah, so he asked specifically about the situation in Ethiopia, particularly in the north, in the Tigray region, and how that has impacted the relationship with Eritrea. So I haven't paid enough attention to this particular conflict. In part, I have found it very hard to get information and good information out of the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Everything I find on Ethiopia just seems so slanted one way or another that I really haven't covered a lot of it on the show. I did have read some UN reports about that region verging on a near famine, and my understanding is while there are a lot of Tigrayans in Eritrea, they are fairly different people, at least politically at this point, and so there are hostilities between those two groups and the Ethiopian government. As we've been talking about in this show for a few years now, when the civil war first broke out in Ethiopia, one of the things that happens, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I believe, put his Nobel Peace Prize around his neck that he got for negotiating with Eritrea, and then went and took that to that country and made a deal with their military to help him deal with the Tigrayans in northern Ethiopia. Um, Other places in Africa, I think a lot of how things develop in 2024 will really depend on how the US and France kind of respond to these Sahel region countries, particularly Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, uh, essentially declaring independence from the Francophone Empire after decades and decades. Really now shaking off the last vestiges of the French colonialism, kicking out the French troops and things like that. So it could be a period of a lot of instability where you have really major political changes. I'm sure in the way that these countries receive funding and what foreign countries that they do business with, and how that's going to prop up and change different sectors of their countries. These are going to be major changes that come with a lot of instability. Um, and then, of course, there are wars going on in pretty significant conflicts. The biggest one would be Sudan. And again, this is a conflict where I've had a really hard time feeling like I'm getting information that is not biased. I think essentially everybody in Sudan is not every single person, the Sudanese people, but both military actors here, the Sudanese military and the rapid response forces. These are the former genocide committing forces in the Darfur region. Are not good actors on either side. And my understanding is the fighting has actually reunited some of the ethnic tensions in the Darfur region, and so that's created some more problems. So this is probably something that I should be paying more attention to on the show. It's so hard to I'm not even sure what level of time I would need to spend to be able to cover this in a way that I feel really capable of bringing you this news. Maybe if I try to find some guests on some of these African conflicts, but since Danny Sherjan stopped writing, who, by the way, Danny is great. I really love that guy. We I haven't found a real good source for Africa that I feel is definitely unbiased. But I will look, and I will try to do some more stuff on Africa. And then of course there's a conflict in the Congo, which has some importance to what we talk about, because the Israelis want to send the Palestinians there. And then the last question I had was on how I think the war in Ukraine is going to end. And I had a couple questions on this. And so there are a lot of factors here. And of course, there have been people predicting for essentially 2 years now that the Ukrainian military was on the verge of collapse. And I worry that, we're now getting to the point where that could happen. And I don't think this is really the outcome for the war that we want. I think it's better if you have a negotiated settlement where Ukraine gets to keep as much of their country as possible. I don't know where the thinking of the Russians and Vladimir Putin are right now. Some of the public statements make me fairly optimistic that what Putin is really thinking about here is, let's see, Putin is thinking about here just settling for the four regions that he has annexed. Well, I guess five with Crimea, and then calling an end to the war. Another part of me strategically, kind of, this is just my analysis. I always thought that if Putin went to war, serious war in Ukraine, that Odessa would have to be a city that he takes to really control and neuter the Ukrainian state. So we will kind of see how this all plays out in 2024. As we'll talk about in today's show, the Ukrainians have some challenges upcoming. But let's get into the news today. First up here, New Hampshire House of Representatives passes Defend the Guard. So Defend the Guard is something that we have talked about on the show quite a bit. This was just a press release from Bring Our Troops Home. This might have been then written by Hunter DeRensis, who previous guest of the show. Defend the Guard has just passed in the New Hampshire House of Representatives on a vote of 187 to 182. House Bill 229 would prohibit the deployment of the New Hampshire National Guard into overseas combat unless Congress first declares war. The third largest legislative body in the English-speaking world has just struck an incredible blow against the D.C. empire. The party breakdown has 163 Republicans and 22 Democrats in favor, with 156 Democrats and 26 Republicans against. Thank you to every legislator who upheld their oath to the U.S. Constitution. Protecting the lives of our soldiers should never be a partisan issue. And then the press release goes on to say, thank you to all the local activists who door knocked, phone banked, and contacted their representatives about HB 229, and particularly to Derek Prue, who demonstrated incredible leadership. And of course, Derek was on this show not that long ago talking about this legislation, saying that he thought it had a chance to pass. And boy, is this a real victory. So congrats, Derek, and New Hampshire, all my buddies up there. Hopefully this has a chance to pass the Senate. I know it's going to be an uphill fight for that to happen. And I will stay in touch with Derek and the crew at Bring Our Troops Home. And, as that this becomes a bigger issue time-wise, as they're ramping up their efforts for the Senate, I will try to have somebody on the show to talk about what they think their chances are. And if we could really get a state to pass Defend the Guard, that would be absolutely huge. All right, next up here is One on Assange by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Bill introduced in House calls for U.S. to drop charges against Julian Assange. A resolution introduced in the House last month calls for the U.S. to drop charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for journalism that exposed U.S. war crimes. The bill, introduced by Representative Paul Gosar, expresses the sense of the House of Representatives that regular journalistic activities, including the obtainment of and publication of information, are protected under the First Amendment, and that federal government should drop all charges and attempts to extradite Julian Assange. Assange, who has been held in London's Belmarsh prison since 2019, has a hearing scheduled at the UK High Court on February 20th and 21st to appeal his extradition to the US, which is likely his final chance. Ahead of the hearings, WikiLeaks and Assange supporters are asking Americans to contact their House of Representatives and urge them to support Gosar's resolution. So far, it has 8 co-sponsors, so it's bipartisan here. We have James McGovern from Massachusetts, Massey, MTG, Anya Paulina Luna, who's a Republican from Florida, Eric Burlinson, a Republican from Missouri, Jeff Duncan, Republican South Carolina, Ilhan Omar, and Clay Higgins, a Republican from Louisiana. So a couple names I don't recognize, a couple, of course, my audience is pretty familiar with. All right, next up here. New charges against Senator Menendez include accepting bribes to boost Qatari influence. This from Politico. Senator Menendez spoke kindly of Qatar in official proceedings to help a developer friend who paid him bribes, according to new legal filings against the New Jersey senior senator. According to the latest indictment, Menendez introduced a co-defendant to a member of the Qatari royal family, hoping to receive financing for a major project, and he made multiple public statements supporting the government of Qatar. And so, it's good to see that Menendez, one of the worst senators that we have going down in a fiery pit of corruption. I just imagine that this is very widespread in Washington and that Menendez is just the one that happened to be caught, not the one that was the only one doing this. All right, few stories on Ukraine here. I wrote this one for the Institute on January 3rd. Only a very small number of Leopard 2 tanks remain operating in Ukraine. A German official said a very small number of modern German battle tanks are still operating in Ukraine. The politician called on the German manufacturing industry to produce more parts to make repairs. Kiev's backers had depleted their arms stockpiles and are now struggling to find enough weapons to keep the Ukrainian military fighting. Sebastian Schaefer, a German Green Party member, is urging manufacturers to produce more tanks and tank parts and said only a very small number of Leopard 2 tanks transferred to Ukraine are still operating. So Business Insider reports only a few of the modern Leopard 2 tanks supplied by Germany to Ukraine are still being deployed in the war, largely because spare parts for repairs are lacking, according to a defense budget discussion maker in Germany's parliament. Kiev received about 80 Leopard 2 tanks from Western backers. The US and UK have provided a smaller number of Abrams and Challenger tanks. Additionally, a myriad of countries have sent Ukraine well over 100 Leopard 1 tanks. The destruction of Ukraine's tanks add to the shortages facing frontline soldiers. The U.S. has nearly exhausted its stockpile of 155mm shells. The White House has attempted to cover the shortfall by saying Ukraine cluster munitions. Still, Ukrainian soldiers report only having the supplies to fire a dozen shells per day. The Western stockpile of air defenses is also running low. Japan recently agreed to send the U.S. homemade Patriot interceptors. The Japanese missiles free up Washington to send Ukraine its American-made interceptors. The UK recently announced it had converted 200 air-to-air interceptors to be fired from the ground to be shipped to Ukraine. However, a top defense official in London warned that the UK weapons stockpiles were now depleted. All right, next up here, a little bit of good news on the Ukraine war. Russia-Ukraine conduct major UAE brokered prisoner swap. Russia and Ukraine on Wednesday announced their largest prisoner swap of the conflict in a deal that was brokered by the UAE. Zelensky said that 230 Ukrainians were freed in the deal, including 213 soldiers, 11 officers, and 6 civilians. Russian media reported 248 Russian service members were released from Ukrainian captivity. The UAE's foreign minister says the deal was reached thanks to friendly ties with both nations. And so it's amazing that, what you could achieve when you try to have diplomacy rather than just picking a side to bat militarily and trying to force, that state's wills on everyone like the U.S. is doing in Israel. All right, next up here. This is an article from the New York Times, Ukrainians turning off Ukrainian state media. So the New York Times reports, but after nearly 2 years of war, Ukrainians have grown weary of Telemarathon United News. What was once seen as a crucial tool for holding the country together is now increasingly derided as little more than a mouthpiece for the government. Viewers have complained that the program often paints a rosy picture of the war, hiding worrying developments on the front lines in the West, eroding support for Ukraine, and ultimately failing to prepare citizens for a long war. Over time, viewership and trust in Telemarathon has plummeted, which experts see as a sign of wider public disenfranchisement with the government as victory on the battlefield becomes elusive. And so, I covered this on the last episode of the show, that there was reports that in the Times of London that a growing number of Ukrainians had, want to seek for peace and are just too afraid to speak out publicly on it for fear of what will happen to them from the Ukrainian state. We have like a near Soviet level of control that Zelensky has over his people and what they think. Next up here is one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. And this is just explaining, more of what we've already talked about on the show and, about the Ukraine arming. The Pentagon said Thursday that the U.S. is out of money to arm Ukraine as Congress is yet to authorize more spending on the proxy war. The Pentagon technically has $4.2 billion in presidential drawdown authority to ship weapons to Ukraine, but doesn't have the funds to replenish the arms. We have the authority to spend that from available funds, but wouldn't have the ability to replenish the stocks by taking money out or taking stuff out of our inventory, the Pentagon spokesperson, General Pat Ryder, said. We're out of money. And so we'll see what Congress passes and what the Pentagon is going to do. I would assume that they don't tap into these 4.2 billion in funds, but I am kind of waiting for the White House to come up with a little budgetary trick to do that in order to give them another month or two of being able to arm Ukraine and give the White House time to try to strong arm the Republicans into passing that massive aid bill. All right, next up here, two very important stories on the situation on the Korean Peninsula, which is escalating rapidly now. U.S. and South Korea conduct training simulating assassination of Kim Jong-un. As top South Korean defense officials said, Washington and Seoul have considered assassinating the North Korean leader. The simulations have gone as far as a joint special operations training mission. South Korean Defense Minister Shin Wok-sik explained to reporters last month that the deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons or the assassination of North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un were options being discussed between Washington and Seoul. While it's difficult to openly discuss decapitation, the Republic of Korea and the U.S. Special Operations Forces are conducting training. Won-sik said, this training is for aerial maneuvers, raids on key facilities, and indoor mop-up. The Daily Beast first reported the U.S. and South Korea would conduct decapitation war games in August of 2022. Those had previously been suspended by the Trump administration in 2017. Since President Joe Biden has taken office, tensions have risen sharply on the Korean Peninsula. Currently, the administration has abandoned the Donald Trump-era diplomacy with Pyongyang. Biden has deployed some of America's most advanced weapons to the region and ramped up military engagements with South Korea. Pyongyang has responded to Washington's provocations by stepping up its military capabilities. North Korea has conducted several missile tests, including with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Pyongyang successfully placed a satellite into orbit in 2023 and plans 3 more this year. Kim and other top North Korean officials have warned several times in the past year that the U.S. and South Korean military activities have put the peninsula on the brink of a nuclear war. During a major address, Kim explained Pyongyang would further its nuclear weapons program during the coming year. And then I have another piece, basically a follow-up. More U.S. and South Korean war games were just concluded. So I wrote this one on January 4th. U.S. and South Korea conduct live fire drills near North Korean border. American and South Korean soldiers had deployed heavy weapons near the North Korean border for live-fire war games. North Korea views the joint military exercises as preparations for regime change war. Last month, a South Korean official said Washington and Seoul simulated the assassination of Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. The South Korean army said the week-long war games involved heavy weapons and ended on Thursday. For the drills, a South Korean mechanized infantry brigade joined an American Army Stryker brigade. In total, over 110 weapons platforms were used, including tanks, anti-aircraft artillery, combat earth movers, attack aircraft, and armored fighting vehicles. The drills came in addition to naval live-fire war games conducted on Wednesday. On Thursday, North Korean state media slammed the drills. This is from the KCNA, which is North Korean state media report. Reality shows that peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula and the region can never be achieved so long as the reckless moves of the puppet group who greeted the new year with confrontational remarks and a roar of artillery guns for war are allowed to go on. The more desperate the group of mad dogs, no more than faithful war shot brigade and cannon fodder of the U.S. run amok, the earlier they will go to the slaughterhouse. The confrontation maniacs will only suffer the most painful moments that they can never imagine in the new year too. So I do believe as well this statement North Korea conducted some artillery drills. There were some reports that these were at least fired near the South Korean border. I'm not sure. So I need to do more looking on that. But my understanding is that on January 5th here that this situation is continuing to escalate. So I wrap up this article by just, mentioning some of the contents that we had already talked about. Now it is time to get into the situation in Gaza, which is absolutely horrific. All right, Ned's this first one from Dave DeCamp, January 2nd, antiwar.com. U.S. Ben-Gvir trade barbs over plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So the State Department on Tuesday criticized comments from two Israeli ministers about their desire to expel Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, an idea that is favored by many officials within the Israeli government. So it's Finance Minister Smotrich and Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir both said on Monday that they want to encourage the migration of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and establish a Jewish settlement in the enclave. And so State Department spokesperson Matt Miller said the United States rejects statements from Israeli Minister Smotrich and Ben-Gvir advocating for the resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. This rhetoric is inflammatory and irresponsible. Miller added that the U.S. has been told repeatedly and consistently by the government of Israel, including by the Prime Minister, that such statements do not reflect the policy of the Israeli government. They should stop immediately. However, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said at a Likud party meeting last week that he was looking for countries to absorb the Palestinians. Ben-Gvir fired back at the State Department and said Israel would follow through on its plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza of its Palestinian Arab residents. This is what he, I believe, posted on Twitter. We highly value Americans' friendship, but respectfully, we aren't another star on the American flag. We'll do what is best for Israel. Facilitating the relocations of hundreds of thousands from Gaza will allow those in the Israeli-Gaza border communities to return home and live security while safeguarding by the IDF soldiers. While expressing concern about Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's rhetoric, the U.S. continues to provide unconditional military aid and support for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. So next up I have, this is some quotes I pulled from a article that was published by the Times of Israel. So the Times of Israel said what they call voluntary resettlement. So those are not my words. Those are the words that the Israeli government is using. It kind of makes me sick to even say it, but that is just some very, very disgusting propaganda that they're trying to use by claiming that basically by starving the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, that they would agree then to be voluntarily resettled if, they're offered to not be starved to death somewhere else. So the Times of Israel reports the voluntary resettlement of Palestinians from Gaza is slowly becoming a key official policy of the government, with senior officials saying that Israel has held talks with several countries to potentially for their potential absorption. So these are some of the what the Israeli government is saying. A senior source in the Israeli government says Congo will be willing to take migrants, and we're in talks with others. Netanyahu said, our problem is finding countries that are willing to absorb Gazans, and we are working on it. Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, member of the Knesset, Danny Danon, claimed that the world is already discussing the possibility of what he calls voluntary immigration. The intelligence minister said, voluntary migration is the best and most realistic program for the day after the fighting ends. At the end of the war, Hamas rule will collapse. There will be no municipal authorities. The civilian population will be entirely dependent on humanitarian aid. There will be no work, and 60% of Gaza's agricultural land will become security buffer zones. The Gaza problem is not just our problem. The world should support humanitarian immigration, because that is the only solution I know. So there we have, from top Israeli officials, including the prime minister, ethnic cleansing is policy. So a little bit more on this in a write-up from Day to Camp. So the idea of ethnic clemency in Palestine is slowly becoming an official Israeli government position, Zaman Israel reported on Wednesday. So he talks about some of the things I do, including the Congo and the voluntary resettlement. It's so disturbing that this is happening just so recently. And Dave, one of the reasons I brought up his article here is he has another member of the opposition party. So this isn't even a member of the Likud party, but this is the opposition to Netanyahu. This is Ram Ben Barak, and he called for Western countries to take part in the Palestinian refugees going to the U.S. And so just to show this is, widespread. It's not just Netanyahu and to the people who are more extreme and more to the right of him. It's also, their opposition as well. Next up here, White House slams South Africa's genocide case against Israel. So the White House on Wednesday claimed South Africa's genocide case against Israel that was filed at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, one of the U.S. top courts based in The Hague, and they just attacked it and claimed it was nonsense. When asked about the 84-page lawsuit South Africa filed against Israel, White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said, "We find the submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any kind of basis in fact whatsoever," which this is one of the things that I discussed with Judge Andrew Napolitano yesterday on his show, Judging Freedom. And I think 8 pages, a solid 8 pages. And mind you, the quotes that I just discussed in that Times of Israel article were too late to be included in it. But a solid 8 pages of this 84-page indictment are just going through Israeli government statements and saying that, look, this guy who's in this position in the government with this power is saying that the Palestinians must go. We got this guy in this position saying we're going to kill them all, right? Like, this is just what the Israeli government has said, and that's how you know it's a genocide. So the U.S. is just denying that the genocide is taking place because Biden is committed to giving weapons to Israel. And we have this here from Day to Camp, January 2nd, antiwar.com. No serious discussions within Biden administration about limiting military aid to Israel. Despite the mass slaughter Israel is committing in Gaza, there are no serious discussions within the Biden administration about cutting off Israel or placing any conditions on military aid, the New York Times reported on Sunday. The report detailed President Biden's commitment to supporting the Israeli campaign, saying he has involved himself more intensely in the conflict than almost any other issue in 3 years in office. President Biden has had tense conversations with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and has made meager efforts to get Israel to change its tactics, but refuses to use any leverage the U.S. has over Israel. At the same time, Israel recognizes the U.S. is its main backer and doesn't want to blow off President Biden's suggestions altogether. Israel has agreed to take some steps the U.S. has asked for, including allowing delivery aids into Gaza, which the UN and other aid agencies saying is entirely inadequate for the situation, with as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the enclave are facing famine-like conditions. The Times report said Israeli officials recognize that he is the most important ally they have amid the rising global criticism and understands that he is the only thing stopping the United Nations from imposing sanctions. Besides the unconditional military support, the U.S. also provides Israel with political cover and vetoed or worked to water down several resolutions at the UN Security Council that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that the death toll in Gaza has passed 22,000 and a total that includes over 8,000 children. I think that's over 9,000 now. I think the latest I read was 9,100 children and 6,500 women. So just absurd numbers. All right, so we have people within the Biden administration being absolutely disgusted by Biden's support. In an open letter announcing his resignation, a senior education department official slammed President Joe Biden for supporting Israel's war in Gaza. I wrote this article on January 3rd for the Libertarian Institute. In 3 months, Israeli forces had killed tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza and pushed hundreds of thousands to the brink of survival. Tariq Habash, a special assistant in the Education Department Office of Planning, announced his resignation in a letter published on Wednesday. He is a political appointee as well as a Palestinian American. In the letter, he explained that he campaigned for Biden in 2020. He wrote, "I cannot stay silent as this administration turns a blind eye to the atrocities committed against innocent Palestinians in what leading humanitarian rights expert had called a genocidal campaign by the Israeli government." He is one of hundreds of Biden administration staffers or, members of the administration and U.S. government who have signed on to a myriad of statements condemning the White House's support for Israel and asking the president to call for a ceasefire. However, President Biden has firmly refused to place any conditions on the military aid the U.S. provides to Israel and has prevented the UN Security Council from adopting a resolution calling for a ceasefire. The Israeli military operations in Gaza have decimated the strip. At least 22,000 Palestinians have been killed, including 9,100 children and 6,500 women. Another 7,000 people in Gaza are missing, likely dead or dying under the rubble. Habash criticized Biden for questioning the Palestinian casualty figures. He wrote, "The president has publicly questioned the integrity of Palestinian death counts frequently used by our own State Department, the United Nations, and numerous humanitarian non-governmental organizations. I cannot be quietly complicit as the administration fails to leverage its influence as Israel's strongest ally to halt the abusive and collective punishment tactics that have cut off Palestinians in Gaza from food, water, electricity, fuel, and medical supplies, leaving widespread disease and starvation. The destruction of the Strip's infrastructure and the stifling of aid shipments present a second crisis for the Palestinians. Over 500,000 Palestinians are in a state of starvation. At least an additional 250,000 are suffering from respiratory infection or diarrhea. Nearly all the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are displaced from their homes. Many are living in deplorable makeshift tents or in overcrowded shelters." So just unbelievably horrific what is happening in Gaza. Next up here, Biden campaign staffers protest U.S. support for Israel's Gaza onslaught. A group of 17 staffers for President Biden's 2024 re-election campaign have signed onto an anonymous letter protesting the president's support for the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The letter says, "Complicity in the death of over 20,000 Palestinians, 8,200 of whom are children, simply cannot be justified." The staffer said that President Biden was losing support due to his full-throated support for the Israeli campaign, noting that 72% of voters under 30 disapprove of his handling of the conflict. Recent polling has shown that the majority of Americans favor a ceasefire in Gaza, an idea the president opposes. And this is actually an article that I wrote, and really cool. The Ron Paul Liberty Report. Ron and Dan discussed this quite at length, I believe, on Tuesday's episode of their show, maybe Wednesday's episode of their show, but definitely check that out. I wrote this article for the Institute that said that 20% of Americans, a quadrupling of the number are doubling. 40% of Americans named a foreign policy issue as a top concern of theirs. 20% said foreign wars were a top issue of theirs, and that number was a quadrupling over the previous year. I think almost more important, though, was that Biden was actually losing to Trump among Latino and young voters. And particularly in the young voter category, it would be hard to deny that it's Biden's support for Israel that is driving that number even lower. So President Biden, the letter, just one last thing from the letter here. President Biden for president staff have 7 seen volunteers quit in droves, and people who have voted blue for decades feel uncertain about doing so for the first time ever because of this conflict. So it's kind of just backing up what the polling numbers are saying. All right. And Biden has dissent from his own policy on what he is doing here. So this is an article from The Hill, and they had collected some quotes from Democratic senators, or Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with the Dems, about Biden's weapons sale to Israel. So this is what Elizabeth Warren said. The U.S. must not write a blank check for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war in Gaza and his right-wing government, which has demonstrated a gross disregard for Palestinian civilians. If the Biden administration won't be transparent with Congress and the American people, Congress should add to close these loopholes for arms sales to Israel. Senator Chris Van Hollen said, congressional review is a critical step for examining any large arms sales. The administration's decision to repeatedly short circuit was already a quick time frame for congressional review, undermines transparency and weakens accountability. The public deserves answers. Senator Bernie Sanders called for Congress to block an aid package to Israel and said, we recognize that Hamas's barbaric attack began this war. We must also recognize that Israel's response has been grossly disproportionate, immoral, and a violation of international law. Senator Tim Kaine said, just as Congress has a crucial role to play in all matters of war and peace, Congress should have a full visibility over the weapons we transfer to any other nation. Unnecessarily bypassing Congress means keeping the American people in the dark. We need a public explanation for the rationale behind these decisions, the second such decision this month. So all pretty critical of their president, especially for senators who are usually fairly entrenched in their policy. Don't criticize the leader of their party. All right, next up here from Dave DeCamp. Poll: only 15% of Israelis want Netanyahu to remain in power after Gaza war. Only 15% of Israelis think Prime Minister Netanyahu should remain in office once the campaign in Gaza is over, according to a new poll published Tuesday by the Israel Democracy Institute. And I think this just goes to show what I've been saying since the start of this, that the only thing keeping Netanyahu first so in power, but secondly out of jail, is that this war is going on, which means, at least the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, if not finding other enemies in the region to escalate with, whether that's the Palestinians in the West Bank or Hezbollah in the north, opened up new battles and fights and try to take more territory from Lebanon, or kick the Palestinians out of the West Bank, anything to keep the conflict going and to keep him out of jail. The polling also found that former Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz, a member of Netanyahu's war cabinet, received more support, but that's only 23%. And then 30% did not name a preferred leader. So I guess the Israelis probably feel like the Americans, where there's not many good options in leaders. All right, this here from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Israeli drone strike in Beirut kills senior Hamas official. An Israeli drone strike hit a Hamas office in Beirut on Tuesday, killing at least 6 people, including a senior Hamas official. A U.S. official told the Washington Post that Israel was responsible for the strike that killed Salah al-Arari, the deputy chief of Hamas's political bureau. The Israeli attack on the Lebanese capital marks a huge escalation that could provoke a major war. Hamas has confirmed the death and released a statement on his assassination. It said, the cowardly assassination carried out by the Zionist occupation against the leaders and symbols of our Palestinian people inside and outside of Palestine will not succeed in breaking the will and steadfastness of our people or undermine the continuation of their valiant resistance. The most important thing here is that this guy was actually a hostage negotiator. And so, it's one thing to kill a militant commander on the ground in Gaza. It's another to kill a member of Hamas in a third country. It's even another if you kill the man that you're trying to negotiate with. So Again, it kind of shows that the Netanyahu government really doesn't want this conflict in any way to wind down. They don't even want to pause in fighting. They have to not only reject the Palestinians' hostage release deal, but then kill the man who proposed it. Absolutely disgusting and shameful that the U.S. is backing this. This one, day to camp, White House says nobody should shed a tear for senior Hamas official killed by Israel in Beirut. This was John Kirby, who said, we're not in position to confirm specific reports. I would just tell you that the al-Harari was a noted designated global terrorist. If he is in fact dead, nobody should shed a tear for his loss. Again, just completely ignoring his role as a mediator in the hostage release talks, which is very important. But worse, endorsing what Israel is doing here when it could lead to a wider conflict that involves the Americans is absolutely insane. All right, this one is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Amid escalation, Israel attacks Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon, with a very real possibility that the assassination of a senior Hamas figure earlier this week could expand the ongoing war. Israel seemingly increased the odds on Thursday with a flurry of attacks on Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon. These hit an observation post and multiple infrastructure targets. They also struck an anti-tank squad. So the Hamas official, as we already explained, was a critical figure in broking the Israel hostage exchange and was reportedly trying to get another one before Israel killed him. Hamas's leader, Nasrallah, warned in a television address that the assassination will not go unpunished, and hitting Beirut was a very big deal. While top Likud figures were crowing about the killing, many Israelis were openly expressing concern about the death, effectively put the hope of a hostage exchange to bed. For those who still have family members held by Hamas, this is clearly nothing to celebrate. So great point there by Jason. Couple more articles before we wrap up here. U.S. drone strike kills Iraqi militia leader in Baghdad. This seems about as provocative as what Israel did in Beirut. A U.S. drone strike in Baghdad killed a senior militia leader on Thursday, marking another significant escalation that could lead to a full-blown regional war. The strike killed Tablik al-Saldi, known as Abu Talik, a deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces operated in Baghdad. The PMF is a coalition of mostly Shia Iraqi militants that take part in the government security forces. At least one other militia member was killed in the strike, which targeted a PMF base in Baghdad. Later on Thursday, the Pentagon confirmed it was responsible for the bombing. The Pentagon claims the target was believed to be responsible for the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria that started in October in response to U.S. support for Israel's onslaught in Gaza, but the U.S. has not provided any evidence for that assertion. And on top of it, even if he was responsible, this is likely to provoke more attacks over than deterring them or preventing them. All right, now we have this situation in Iran where I think about 80 people were killed in a twin bombing at the grave of Soleimani. So initially we had this from Day to Camp. Iran, it happens in Iran vows a harsh response. And then we now have ISIS taking credit. So this is what Dave DeCamp writes on January 4th. ISIS took credit for the Wednesday bombing in Kerman, Iran that killed at least 84 people, but Iran has yet to formally attribute blame for the attack. According to Iran's press TV, ISIS issued a statement on its Telegram channel that said 2 of its members detonated explosive belts in a suicide attack. Iranian officials initially said 2 bombs were likely placed in beds at the scene, but a source told Iran's IRNA news agency that at least one of the explosions was a result of the suicide bombing. The bombing targeted a memorial commemorating the 4th anniversary of the U.S. killing of Iranian Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani, who was targeted by the U.S. drone strike in Baghdad on January 3rd of 2020. Initial reports said over 100 was killed, but the latest death toll has been revised down to 84. Israel is also a suspect in the bombing since it has a history of carrying out sabotage attacks inside Iran, but never anything on the scale of the bombing in Kernan. And so, I guess the one thing I would point out here is I'm not sure that Israel would do this. I think it's too steep of an escalation too quickly after the drone strike in Beirut. I think Israel is looking to keep tensions in the Middle East very high, but this would seem to be very, very high. It would really, really crank up the burner. Now, there's a couple possibilities here. One, Israel had some role here in, kind of behind the scenes helping to facilitate some kind of attack. And what got actually produced and carried out by ISIS was far larger than maybe the Israelis intended. Another possibility is that the Israelis had nothing to do with it, and ISIS is just looking to stoke the division in the Middle East and kind of exploit the current tensions for their own gain. And the other thing I want to mention is, in a very real sense, for the Iranian people, it might not matter who is responsible for it. Israel has carried out so many attacks and things that really would be considered terrorism, assassinating civilian energy officials and things like that. Absolutely huge, to do that inside Iran. And then the strikes on drone bases, and the fact that just last week you had the former Israeli prime minister writing an article in the Wall Street Journal calling for more attacks on Iran, will make a lot of Iranians impossible to convince that this wasn't Israel. And so I think there's going to always be that that feeling, and that's going to create certain political pressures on the Iranians to respond strongly to this. So we'll see what the Iranian government does. One thing is that the Iranian government is usually very measured in their responses, so hopefully that remains true. Last article here today. Thank you guys for hanging with me through the Q&A and in the longer opening than usual. I know this is a longer show, but we have a lot of important stuff today. And, I was looking for stories that I could be like, this is something I could talk about Monday. I essentially felt like everything I had on the show today were things that I really needed to talk about today, because by the time we get to Monday, we're already going to be updating what we talk about today because the escalations are coming so quickly. And this story included in it: U.S. allies release statement threatening Houthis over Red Sea attacks. The U.S. and some of its allies released a joint statement on Wednesday threatening Yemen's Houthis over their attacks on the Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea, which started as a response to the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza. The statement reads, "Let our message now be clear. We call for the immediate end of these illegal attacks and release of unlawfully detained vessels and crews. The Houthis will bear responsibility of the consequences should they try to continue to threaten the lives, the global economy, and the free flow of commerce in the region's critical waterways." Now, just want to make a couple points here. I think what the Houthis are doing here is they are making a bid for legitimacy. For 8 years now, the Houthis have rolled Sana'a. And for 8 years, essentially every other country on earth, except maybe Iran, has essentially recognized a bunch of exiled Yemenis from the south who live in Saudi Arabia as the rightful legitimate government of Yemen, and that the Houthis, the people who are actually governing 80% of the Yemeni population, are nothing more than Iranian-backed rebels and usurpers who are just holding the capital city for no reason. When in reality, they probably have a far better claim to power than Mansour Hadi, the guy that Hillary Clinton elected in 2012. And with Ali Abdullah Saleh now dead, a stronger claim than essentially anybody in Yemen to rule that country. And so I think what the Houthis are doing here is, by carrying out these attacks, which they say are on Israeli-linked shipping, and I'm not sure that the Houthis get it right 100% of the time. So if they have attacked ships that have nothing to do with Israel, I wouldn't be surprised. But they say that they're targeting the Israeli-linked shipping. And so now anybody who goes to war or conflict with them is doing so on behalf of Israel, right? And so I think this is probably going to bestow a lot of legitimacy on the Houthis from their partners in the Middle East and from other Muslim countries. This could, for all their withholding, holding out against the Saudis, their ability to bypass the top Western anti-aircraft systems and hit Saudi oil refineries and things like that. For all the things that the Houthis have done that really are the things about governing a country, I think this is actually what could get them legitimacy. I do think that this is going to involve the US and UK at least bombing Yemen. From what we've seen through the 8 years of Saudi bombing, I can't imagine that the US and UK are going to drop enough bombs on Yemen to get the Houthis to concede. We've seen the Houthis willing to sustain some very high casualty numbers. At least 400,000 Yemenis have been killed during the Saudi war on Yemen. They've withstood starvation, sanctions, full international blockades of their country. They've, been very effective. The U.S. has passed the Saudi Arabia has an American military. It's just, Saudis fly the planes and I guess get to pit the targets, but America was helping them with the intelligence, the target picking. They're flying American planes. They're dropping American bombs. And even then, the Houthis were able to maintain their military capabilities. And so I don't see any reason why the US and UK are going to be able to inflict a blow upon the Houthis that get them to concede after what they've just spent 8 years withstanding. And I think from the Houthi perspective, there's probably only upside here in the fact that you're going to finally start to get that legitimacy. Anybody who is now going to war against you, bombing you, is doing so on behalf of the Israelis. And if we look, right now, as the US and UK are preparing to bomb Saudi Arabia, bomb Yemen, Saudi Arabia is still trying to make peace with the Houthis and still trying to get that peace deal to go through. So, I don't think this is going to play out poorly for the Houthis. But we will see. I do think there could be airstrikes this weekend. That's why I want to bring up that article now. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the show today and for all the support you give me. Again, if you haven't already, check out Part of the Problem. Check out my appearance on Judging Freedom. And I will be back with more shows next week.